most of you have really done some watching and some writing about Napoleon already, but I want to talk a little bit about Napoleon's career and we'll kind of talk about it in big picture terms. Early on, remember, Napoleon is a military leader. He is during the Directory phase. He is responsible for expelling Austria and liberating northern Italy for France. And there he had kind of gotten his taste for being in charge. In 1798, he had been sent by the Directory to fight the British in Egypt, which had gone terribly for him, but he manages to make his way back home. He's approached by really the conspirators to overthrow the Directory, and in 1799 he will overthrow the Directory and become first consul in France. But if you look at the French really Republic and the beginnings of really France in 1800, when Napoleon takes control, France already has control of the major areas. Napoleon is going to increase that. Okay, with really the government in disarray, Napoleon takes control in November of 1789, proclaims himself to be first consul, and he will eventually make himself consul for life. And then 2 years later, he's going to proclaim himself to be emperor. But during this phase, he does some tremendous reforming inside of France. Okay, he will really propose the laws. It's technically a constitutional government, all right? There's a legislature, there is a Senate, but there's really this new constitution doesn't include the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, and so essentially it's a dictatorship, pretty much run by Napoleon. As such, he will do some major reforming. Like I told you, he will create the Bank of France to give the French some stability in economics. He will heal the breach between France and the Catholic Church by working with the church to issue the Concordat of 1801, where the Concordat is really kind of the healing of this breach left over from the French Revolution between the nation and the Catholic Church. And Napoleon really needs the church to help him in his rule, so he's willing to work with the church. Okay, the really, even though remember that it's not a complete freedom of religion, Napoleon still is in charge. Okay, the he will create the lycée system in France. The lycées are, it's really the word that in French they kind of use for high school, but it is really an educational reform in the beginning that is really turns France into a nation that has a public education system. Okay, and lycées were really used to help educate the next generation of bureaucrats and government servants. He creates the Legion of Honor in 1802, but in 1804 he also creates a massive new legal system that bears his name, the Code Napoleon, and it creates a new civil law system. It creates a new criminal law system, but the most important is that it creates a single law code for France, and then it will spread into the areas that Napoleon will conquer. Okay? It is this idea of equality before the law and property rights, but it doesn't, for example, let workers form unions. It's not this, and it really still upholds patriarchal authority too. So women aren't as equal in the legal system as men were. The Napoleon really and the code go on to influence really law codes all across Europe and even here in America in places like Louisiana. Napoleon also sees an attempt to gain Haitian or an attempt at independence from Haiti. Toussaint Louverture will lead essentially a slave rebellion and an attempted rebellion in Haiti. That slavery, though, is reinstituted in 1802 and it would not be abolished again until 1848. But this rebellion really Napoleon struggles to deal with. In 1803, you guys remember if you're an American history buff, the United States buys this massive amount of territory from Napoleon for $15 million. Napoleon needs some funds, and so during this phase, he will sell us the what becomes Louisiana. He always thought he could get it back, but he sells it to us in 1803 under Jefferson's administration. The But in 1804, Napoleon's going to make this move towards becoming an emperor. All right, and when Napoleon sort of proclaims himself to be emperor, then you enter into this empire phase where Napoleon really is beginning to expand France. Okay, so he is crowned. He crowns Josephine, his wife, as empress. All right, and kind of begins to take on the trappings really of a an emperor. Okay, so and of course he borrows a lot from the old idea of the Roman emperors as well. The And it leads to really a whole new style in furniture and art called the Empire style as well. Now, the and neoclassical architecture as well. Now, Napoleon begins to expand France's borders through warfare. Napoleon will go to war in 1805, even though he does very poorly. The French army, or excuse me, the French navy is defeated down here in Trafalgar in 1805. But on land, France pretty much defeats Austria, Prussia, and Russia, destroys what had been the Holy Roman Empire, and really changes it into the Confederation of the Rhine. So that really, by the time you get to about 1806 or so, even to about 1808 or so, what you really see here is Napoleon completely controls the uh, the continent of Europe. The only exception is Great Britain, who's become his biggest enemy. And Napoleon would really like to invade England and destroy it, but he can't because he's lost his navy after Trafalgar. And so, what he tries to do is to launch this economic war against England called the Continental System. The Continental System, when you look at it here, is essentially Napoleon saying to all these people that he is under control, or he is in control of, that they can't trade with England. And of course, England's going to respond by not allowing anybody to trade with Napoleon or with the countries that he's in control of. So essentially, you have this major economic war between the two powers. But by 1806, you really have to kind of understand that Napoleon is the dominant power in Europe, and France has essentially taken control of all of Europe. Things don't go well for him in certain things. The continental system's not going to go all that well. He's going to face rebellions in Spain and Portugal. The rebellion in Spain, especially in 1808, is very tough on Napoleon. Things do not go very well for him there, and it is sometimes referred to as the Spanish ulcer. And the partisans in Spain will fight a guerrilla war essentially against Napoleon. He doesn't really know how to deal with it. It leads to executions in Spain, and that's what's being depicted here in Goya's Third of May, if you've ever seen that. The Spanish ulcer really plagues Napoleon, and it leads to a lot of people questioning whether or not Napoleon is as dominant as he used to be. So much so that eventually some people began to rebel against Napoleon. The When you look at Napoleon's empire in 1810, these guys are they can't trade with anybody. They can't trade with England. They're being blockaded by the British, and finally, some people are just going to simply have enough. And Russia is going to be the first to break away from Napoleon's continental system. Napoleon has essentially put all of his family on the thrones of various places across Europe, but the Russians have had enough, and they are going to break from the continental system. When they do, Napoleon will raise a huge army of over 600,000 men and decide to invade Russia. It is a disaster. The Russian army retreats to Moscow, draws the French into the interior of Russia. They don't fight, they just constantly retreat. They burn everything in their path as they retreat. When Napoleon gets to Moscow, it's in flames because the city's been abandoned. Napoleon is in control of the Russian capital, but he is now suddenly deep inside of Russia. It's turning into winter. He doesn't have enough supplies, and he's going to decide to retreat. Well, as soon as he does, Kutuzov and the Russian army will begin to attack, and they will smash Napoleon as he tries to get out of Moscow. The the army by this time has shrunk to over 100,000 troops that begin the retreat. They are starving to death. They are constantly hounded by the Russian army, and about 40,000 will make it up or make it out. Sorry. The When this happens, Napoleon is essentially really beaten. He is forced back into France after being defeated, and really all these Allied forces have risen up in rebellion against him. And Napoleon decides to abdicate. He gives up the throne, tries to make his son the new emperor of France, but the Allies won't take it. So Napoleon abdicates, and he is exiled to Elba, a little island off the coast of Italy. He's given an income of 2 million francs, and he is sent into exile. When that happens, Napoleon is booted out of France essentially, and a new king is placed on the throne, Louis XVIII. So France returns to a monarchy after Napoleon abdicates and sent into exile on Elba, which is this little island right here off the coast of Italy. He's not happy. Napoleon decides that really he would like to get back into power, and he thinks that, and he's right, that most people don't like Louis XVIII, the new king of France. So Napoleon decides to come back, and he will escape Elba, lands in France in March of 1815. Louis XVIII runs away. He has no choice. And when he does, Napoleon makes it into power. He goes to war because the coalition of the Allies won't allow him back in France. So a combined British, Prussian, Austrian force will decide to attack him. So essentially, you have a coalition of Austria, Prussia, Russia, Great Britain that line up in war against Napoleon. He will be defeated at the Battle of Waterloo in June of 1815. And this time, after he is defeated at Waterloo, he is sent into exile on this tiny little island called St. Helena, which is in the middle of the South Atlantic. And he will die in residence in St. Helena. So he dies here, and that's the end of Napoleon. Now, of course, later he would be brought back to France and entombed, and Napoleon's tomb is still a major tourist attraction. Even Hitler visited Napoleon's tomb in 1940 when France was defeated in World War II. Ask yourself, what is Napoleon's legacy? Why is he so important? He comes closer to anyone to conquering all of Europe and essentially had most of Europe under his thumb until he is eventually defeated. Napoleon, though, spread some of the ideals of the French Revolution unwittingly. And what that means later on is that many of these absolute monarchies are going to come under fire as a result of some of these ideals of the French Revolution spreading into their countries. All right,